And we are live and recording.
So I'm gonna go and call this meeting to order. The first item will be reading the meeting protocols.
Nice.
Look at you. Second to last chance, get it right.
Let's just see if I can get this together. Yeah. Right, are you seeing it correctly on your end? Because I know this likes to flip mine. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties. Let me try this again.
Yeah.
Zoom really likes to mess with me in PowerPoint and switch my screens back and forth, so my apologies. There we go. So you're seeing my notes, the public is not. Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Sandine, and I'm serving as the technical host for tonight's meeting. Thank you for your grace and patience as we all adjust to this new platform. We're all learning, and we appreciate your understanding with any technical issues that may pop up today. The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and board and commission members, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement process, please visit https://bouldercolorado.gov/services/productive-atmospheres. The following are examples of rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code and other guidelines that support this vision. These will be upheld during this meeting. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. Obscenity, racial epithets, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the ability to conduct the meeting are prohibited. Participants are required to sign up to speak using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. Because we do not have registration for open and public comment tonight, you can indicate you would like to participate by using the raise hand function. The raise hand button is in the participant box, which can be found in the menu by hovering over the top or the bottom of your screen and then clicking on the participant icon. When the box opens, you will see the raise hand button at the bottom. By clicking that button, you can indicate you would like to participate in open or public comment. If you have joined us by phone, you can press *9 to raise your hands.
So the first item will be the approval of the minutes for the January 10th meeting. So I look for the motion to approve those. Anybody second?
Second.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to public participation.
One moment, please. I need to promote Alex, who is joining us remotely. So she is rejoining as a panelist. It looks like we have Paul Coleman up first.
Hi there. Good evening, everyone. Oh, wow. That was interesting. Yeah, we're getting used to this new platform, I guess. This isn't like a normal Zoom meeting. So I'm happy to be here today. I've missed several EAB meetings in a row now, and you haven't heard from me for a while. But just like to extend my best wishes to EAB to keep up the good work. I've been busy. I'm now on the board of 350 Colorado, and I'm also a designated representative for the ballot initiative to phase out fracking room rents by 2030. So can you guys hear me okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
I can hear you great.
Okay, it just looked like you were kind of distracted there. I'm sorry, I'm not very engaging, I guess. So I'd like to see the city focus on electricity and electrification and equity. These are the issues that I think traditionally city has been focused on and to a certain extent, more or less. I'd like to see EAB really contribute to that focus and make sure that the council gets the message loud and clear that this is what you're interested in seeing them put a lot of emphasis on and money and time. So anyway, thank you very much. Have a productive meeting and I'll talk to you later.
Thank you, Paul.
And if you're just joining us, just please raise your hand if you would like to participate in public participation so that we know who to give those permissions to speak. Looks like that's all for public participation.
Okay, so let's move on to the next item, the big one today, which is figuring out our board priorities to be included in our letter to council next month. So hope you guys all did your homework. So
That's like a high school that crammed it the minute before.
that's okay. I did today. Let's see, Jonathan, how should we do this? I have my ideas. I think Greg, I got your email. Alex, I got your proposal as well. Let's see. I'm thinking maybe, Alex, you can talk about your idea. Greg, you can talk about your ideas. Then you guys can also talk about what you think should be included. Then we can maybe find common topics to group them into, like, for example, I think, Alex, what you talked about is involves what Paul was talking about, electrification, land use. I think, Greg, your ideas will fall under like maybe environmental justice and outreach. I have some ideas about transportation and land use, or at least some recommendations. So maybe we can try like group them into like big tent ideas and then organize like sub items within those, and then just
What I have is touching on equity and accessibility and electrification and access of electricity, so.
okay.
And mine's food systems. One question though is, are we trying to? We're not trying to get everyone's idea in the letter, right?
I think I'm trying to see, I would like to group, like find common topics, like maybe not exactly the idea into the letter, but it's like maybe it relates to transportation, and then within transportation, what is it addressing? What are the questions within that field? And then like, and just see how it goes. Like, I mean, initially I was thinking like, yeah, a letter with like two or three items. But then like you said, we will send a memo as well. So if there's a lot to say, we can have like a one-page cover that.
What's the difference between a memo?
I think
Well,
that would be like a
the-
page or two, and the memo was more like.
Yeah, and the letter to council is like a once a year thing that all of the boards do, whereas, I mean, theoretically, correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, but we could as a board send a memo to council at any time. Whereas the letter to council is like a very specific, all the boards send those in at the same time.
Sure, happy to jump in here. And just for the record, Jonathan Cohen, Director of Climate Initiative. So I sent some follow-up information that I thought might be useful in your conversation tonight. So to the specific question, there's a little bit different instruction this year for council, and your guidance, your thoughts to council can take any written format. So it could be a memo, it could be It could be in a letter, whatever feels good to the board. And I would also say that there is an opportunity, if you feel like it's important to list out themes or things in that regard, and then some specific things that you want council to prioritize over the next 2 years. Again, as a reminder, this is just a way for you all to have your voice heard by council as they go into their retreat in March, so they can be thinking about the priorities of their advisory boards, things that from a policy standpoint, they should really be thinking about, right? And I also just wanted to share this in terms of tonight's exercise. I'm going to be listening for all of the ideas, and I would just say that you are looking to kind of go from a handful, probably down to 2 to 3 priorities. But that doesn't mean that those things that aren't on the letter as a priority get lost. There may be things that you bring up tonight that are more project-based or specific projects, and I would just say that we could think about how to bring those in, how to incorporate those into a work plan, whether it be this year or next year. So just know that I think there's space for a good, broad and healthy dialogue for you all to really think about as policymakers, as city council, what do you want them to hear from you in terms of them setting their priorities? Because again, they'll think big policy and they'll say something broad like, you talk about transportation. What about transportation that you would want council then to filter down to all departments to say, as we look forward, here's what we're not doing right now that we'd like to accelerate, that we'd like to think differently about transportation. It's exploring X, Y, and Z. And then multiple departments would then respond to that policy direction from council. Hopefully that's a little bit helpful.
Okay. Great.
I was just gonna say, should we kind of time box it to make sure we can, in terms of each person presenting, just to make sure. we get
Yeah,
through
I think so.
Yeah.
Just like, Greg, do you want to present your idea? Maybe within in 5 minutes, you kind of talk about like what your proposal, the stuff you sent me.
Sure, yeah, so we're just gonna go one by one.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Well, okay, so I wanna preface it with, like, I actually happened to be able to see Alex's thing beforehand, and I really like, I told you in my thing that I was like, oh, this is not concrete enough in a way, and I really wish I had more time to, one, see what it was like to submit something, and two, just be like, to really dig into what is the city already doing. Being only a few months on board, I'm like, didn't really feel like I knew. So that being said, the 2 ideas I had were more broad. One is around outreach. And I was really wanting to look at, there's a lot of hope, a feeling of hopelessness and amongst a lot of the people who are really into climate and environmentalism. And I'm just looking for a way for these people to feel hope. And so, like, how do we engage the public into conversations? And I know that there's a call-in number. And if somebody's keeping track of my time, they could give me a 3 minute.
That's okay, just keep going.
There's a call-in number that people can give feedback on. I think that's a great idea, and I think that could be expanded to allow other people on public to say, yeah, I like this, so that when the city sees that there's 1,000 people that liked an idea, that's something that the city might take up and go, okay, what do we do about this? I think there's a lot of people that want to know what they can do. And I think that leaves for a lot of room for people getting together and saying, okay, here's how we can make a difference. And I just wonder, is there a way that the city can support, can't dominate or control or legislate necessarily. I'm just, let's help all of us, So that was kind of one general review of how do we reach out and go to whatever festivals like the farmers market and bring people in to how do we solve this as a community? You know, sustainability, resilience. Okay. Number one here. Number two is around reviewing what holds us up.
I want to write them here on the board, maybe, so we can keep track and then we can discuss them, like.
Yeah. I can give you some reviewer. Originally, outreach.
Outreach, right?
Yeah, and it's part of also democratization. Getting the feedback, getting the input of the public.
The other was like maybe community groups.
It could be, but it's just a more matter of, yeah, helping people have a sense of hope and action. And also finding out, I think the Climate Initiative Department is doing a lot of amazing things. And the whole city. I don't know that people know about it.
This is like to like that, what we discussed about 10. And
So I think a lot of it has to do with how to connect the city with the public. And also like really help us pull together as a community to resolve and work through like what's present for people. What are people afraid of? What are people looking for? How do we move forward? So then the second idea was around doing research into, you know, like what holds us back from doing these great ideas that everybody has, you know, like
systemic change.
systemic change. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and my, I guess, actual item for the city council might be to, or I'd love to hear more about from Jonathan, what, like, is there a research group that could come in and help us with determining different things, like why are we not doing more green roofs? Why are we, what is preventing us from being a truly resilient? What prevents us from really, becoming more sustainable?
Good.
And then trying to triage, okay, what will be our best bang for our buck, so to speak. Yeah, it's not just $1.50, but okay, that's gonna be really hard to implement, but it's huge outlet, or. Okay, yeah, good, thank you. Yes. All right.
Me?
Yeah.
Great. So I don't know where to see up now. My personal side hobby is learning about the intersection of climate and food. And I was really interested in looking at our consumption-based emissions, that food was the second highest after transportation. And so it kind of got me thinking and looking into what are we doing and what are we not doing. And I think we're doing a really good job on food waste when it comes to our composting program. And I didn't see too much else going on. So I really think our food systems is a big area for opportunity on a few different levels. So like globally, food systems emissions is around 25, some say up to like 42% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it has some real climate impacts. It's also a really big cross issue sector. So health equity is a really big part of it. I actually, in prepping for this, I met with someone who works for the county in the public health department, and they're really interested in a lot of, from an equity perspective, a lot of the same things that might need to happen from a climate perspective. So for example, like reducing meat and dairy consumption is one of the biggest things we can do. And it has a lot of health equity issues as impacts as well. It hits upon freshwater. That I can't say specifically in Boulder. I think what's hard about the food systems is it doesn't all happen here in the city of Boulder, but I still think there's things we can do and things that we can be big leaders on. So there's a bunch of other cities that are starting to do things. They're really focused on procurement of food, but since Boulder doesn't do a lot of procurement of food, I think we'd have to get more creative. So my proposal for council, I have many ideas, but I think what would make the most sense is one, encouraging council to elevate food systems, food work as an issue within the city and put resources to it. I think one of the best things people can do is hire like a food policy director so that there's someone that can have the conversations with all of the different pieces involved. So it'd be like transportation's a part of it. And as I said, public health, it would probably touch on like youth and like different departments of the city. It wouldn't just, it could just kind of funnel under climate, but I don't think it would be the most impactful and make the most sense. But I do think we need to put resources towards it in a way that has like longevity. So versus just like a one-off study or a one-off something, I think hiring someone, you know, gives them responsibility to execute on long-term projects in a really collaborative way, taking into account resiliency and equity, all these things. So that's my high level. I have lots more thoughts and information if people will have questions about just like the intersections of food and climate, but that's what I got. And I did write a letter, but I just didn't send it to you. Sorry.
I mean, I think we're just trying to kind of get a high level overview what
Yeah.
people thought, and then we can go more into the details as we kind of
Great.
dig deeper into this.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've kept my eye on since applying to the board, and it was part of my application, is the solar grant program that the city does. And I would, currently, it's pretty accessible. You can get up to $8,000 if your household income is under $78,000, I think, for a single person household, and that goes up a little bit with each additional family member. I would love to see that program expanded. The access, the number of people that can access that program, and the amount of money that program is able to provide, especially with what our economy is doing right now and how squeezed people are feeling, even with what used to be very reasonable salaries. There's a lot less financial flexibility in the last couple of years. And so increasing the size of that program to help middle to low income families get access to clean energy in a way that is affordable and will save them money in the long term over oil and gas. I mean, that's most of it. I can go into some more detail if you would like, but mostly just trying to expand that program to make it more equitable, given how strained people are financially. Because, you know, it can be hard to make that initial switch because, you know, in the long term, it's more affordable to have solar panels on your house. But the input cost to get them there is pretty high. It's, you know, getting lower every year, but actually, I don't know if it is recent, but that input cost is some of the biggest hardship for folks. So.
Like the initial cost, right?
Yeah, so reducing the limiting
The investment, the initial investment?
yeah, and providing more partial grants to people with, you know, maybe higher income or just expanding the program in general, I think would be super helpful for our because there's also the solar grant that you can buy into, but if you want like solar on your house, the options are pretty limited.
Does that money come from the climate tax?
I don't know where that money comes from, Jonathan. You would probably know better than I do. I just know about the program, not the exact how it works and where it comes from.
Yeah, and without like, you're tempting me to go into a really long rant right now.
I love the long rant.
All right, so there are a number of programs the city either kind of operates, partners with other entities, particularly in this area of energy equity. So a couple of things that you're talking specifically about some of our solar rebates. We actually offer a good number of them through the Climate Action Tax. We actually partner then with Energy Smart Colorado. So that's the program that we built and then we expanded and is hosted by Boulder County. We also leverage a lot of the funds through Excel because through our actions at the regulatory side of things, we've kind of come around this direction and really regulated that Excel offer a whole lot more incentive for income qualified residents. There's the LEAD program, which is the Low Income Energy Assistance Program, which really looks at rebates, incentives, and bill assistance, both in terms of electricity and gas. So there are a number of programs there. You mentioned community solar, and I think it's important to also recognize that one of the challenges that we face for a long time is this barrier to solar in terms of property or home ownership. And that's just inequitable as it is because the majority of rebates are tied to specifically to property ownership.
Right.
So that excludes 50% of our population right off the bat. So the options then become either working with your landlord or property owner to install solar or doing a community solar garden. And we created that program not only for Colorado, but for the nation, community solar. And we have the first municipally owned low income community solar. Right now it's dedicated to Ponderosa, but we have a whole number of community solar that is specifically as carve outs for low income. That's I think an easier entry to some of the barriers that exist. And I think I want to just appreciate what you're saying, that it's not this or that, it's both.
Right, absolutely.
Because looking at ownership models, that builds equity, right? That's a really important aspect of this. So how can we support, lower that barrier to entry, whether it's upfront cost? If you do own your own home or a manufactured home or a mobile home, you still should have the opportunity to levelize and have predictable energy costs through on-site solar. And extending that, if you can't put it on your home for any reason, then you have that accessibility into community solar, which is going to be lower anyway because you don't have a lot of the infrastructure costs associated. They get woven in, but obviously socialized amongst all of the owners.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I have very vague information, so the specifics that you can provide is helpful.
No, it's super good. And so what I would roll up kind of your comment to be, and I want to just kind of pull in something that Paul Cullen said, something that I hear you saying is just continuing to really prioritize energy equity.
Absolutely.
I'm going to call it climate justice, the ability for all community members, not just those that can afford solar on rooftops, to be able to benefit from solar.
Include actually in this would also be the subsidy for electric scooters.
Mhm.
You know, I know somebody who wanted to get a scooter, qualified for the subsidy, but she still didn't have the money for
Right.
the rest of
Scooter. Are you
costs.
talking about the e-bike
Mhm.
program? Okay, got it, yeah. Yeah, and that was a program that we ran in my office, and we spent about $500,000 out of the climate tax dollars to launch that program, which is a lot of money.
Yeah.
And it was directed at income qualified residents, but you're raising a really good point, which is even with $1,000 or $1,200 off the initial upfront cost of the bike, it's still, you still have that barrier, right? You still have to come up with the cash to invest in that way. Same way with solar, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, and so the specifics that I looked into were about the solar program. But I think it can be broadened more into just general increase of equitable access to other adjacent clean energy and, you know, more electric modes of transportation, and, you know, maybe that's a electric car subsidy or continuing the e-bike subsidy that you mentioned. However exactly that looks, that is easiest to work, but just increasing equitable access to greener sources of energy and transportation.
Sorry for that long.
You had details that I found fascinating.
And while there's a little bit of a pause, the other thing I just wanted to flag for you that I think there's an opportunity for the board to start to kind of weigh in on is how do we create kind of what you're describing and bolted on to a lot of the other services that are provided by the city. So what you're talking about is really specific to clean energy sources, kind of directed in that way. But can we bundle? Can we start to look at the services in a holistic way? So we're actually looking at other utilities. How are we thinking about protecting our most vulnerable to increase costs, issues related to all utilities? So it's water, it's gas, it's electric, it's your transportation costs, all of those things together. So really thinking about that bundling is really.
Alex, you want to go next?
Sure. This is actually a perfect lead into my idea because my idea was basically a solar array as opposed to rooftop solar. So the reason that I was suggesting this was kind of twofold. On one hand, as Jonathan was talking about, solar arrays are a little bit more equitable because it serves a wider population, such as renters, multi-home dwellings, etc. So that's the one piece from the equity perspective. The second piece is that, as Jonathan also mentioned, tends to be cheaper because you have just a different type of infrastructure and you have a larger number of panels that can reside together. So I guess the third piece is it kind of bit off one of the lowest hanging fruits that we have for a gap in where we can improve our greenhouse gas emissions. So for the city, I think the building energy use made up 63% of Boulder's 2022 emissions inventory. So if we can do an electrification to target some of those building usages, that can help cut that. And then Boulder has specifically a stated goal, as we saw, I think, last session, of 100 megawatts of renewable energy locally by 2030. So we're currently around 80 megawatts. So if we can introduce a solar array, that can help close the gap that Boulder has stated as one of its specific goals as well. I guess it also meets a couple of the objectives that were stated in the emission summary report. Like I said before, increasing equitable services, I guess in this case, electrification. So for a somewhat more diverse set of people, as well as establishing a more working our way to 100% renewable electricity. So I guess this is kind of a large scope of a plan in terms of installing a solar array on like public land, which I could think of one potential area that could be used for this. So there's a large swath of land kind of on Cherryvale and 36 going east. It's currently open space, but it's basically a big giant area where dogs can run off leash as an open space area. So regions like that are possible, I guess I would say. But I think because this would be a pretty large in scope type of idea, it would involve a lot of different departments and could also therefore involve a lot of different perspectives and hit a lot of roadblocks along the way. So department wise, I think that would be, climate initiatives, obviously, utilities, anything involving land use codes, open space. That would also be, let's see, what else had I written here? Ecosystems management, planning and development department, as well as, of course, folding in probably Xcel Energy. So those are a lot of moving parts and a lot of different departments that would be involved. My hope is that involving Xcel Energy wouldn't be a complete non-starter because since Xcel Energy it's been required by the Colorado Renewable Energy Standard and the Clean Air and Clean Jobs Act to reduce its operational emissions, and anything that we can fold in with Boulder locally. I'm hoping that would be a somewhat collaborative partnership, but again, potential for disruption there. So I guess for me, it's not exactly clear of what the role of the council members would be explicitly. Obviously, the different steps in this would be finding the correct area to do this in, getting all of the zoning permits and checking in with our land use codes. And if we can get that far and actually go forward in construction, that's, you know, like the whole second ladder portion there. So I guess my question or up for discussion is, I'm not exactly sure what the role of council will be specifically, whether it just be kind of enforcing different measures or checking in that everything is up to par, or if there are certain things that council would do in that situation. But that's the general idea. And if it's too large in scope, the secondary idea was evaluating which, you know, public buildings we could install or improve rooftop solar on to kind of target our building based emissions, because that is such a large contribution.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, so my turn. So what I did for this, I mean, besides brainstorming myself, I contacted different groups in Boulder and asked them, you know, hey, we're going to letter to council. Is there anything? Do you have any feedback? Because I wanted to collect feedback, you know, not only from myself, but like from the community. So I heard back from the Sierra Club, heard back from Boulder Progressives, heard back from Plan Boulder, a couple other people as well. And I think, let's see, one thing, there were like, you know, ranging from like incremental changes to like more systemic changes. One thing that came up was smart regs regulations. So that's something that I would like to bring up as well. And that's more like an incremental change. But basically like make them smart regs, those are like the regulations for rentals that how like basically make it more energy efficient. And there are groups that work with the students, and they say that maybe these regulations are not that stringent, or their feel was that the inspectors don't are not as strict, and then some of the rentals that people are living in don't really comply that well. And I think this kind of relates to what Carolyn said, or like working on embodied carbon and cooling. So that could be part of the conversation. And maybe like increase the requirements, and also work on the reporting, because I think a big concern students have and have experienced is that if they report the landlord is not complying with the regulations, then the landlord's gonna have all the power and then retaliate by not returning the deposits. Or, you know, like being more picky about the deposits. So that's a biggie. That's more like incremental change. Then I think something I heard from opposite sides of the spectrum was land use. Basically relationship between housing, density, transportation, and the environment. And something that I think a question is, what is eco-friendly housing? Because I think there's a contrast between multifamily housing plus ADUs, which is versus you know, what we have been discussing for the last few years, urban heat islands, and what does the balance or middle point look like there? So that's something that kind of needs answered. And then another one was transportation. And I think in this, there's like this is, I think, what I heard mostly was just micromobility. This kind of relates to what you mentioned last time, Rick. emerging technologies, how to make more pedestrian, bike-friendly neighborhoods, like more eco-friendly transportation
Yeah.
neighborhoods. I think that's it. Those were the main topics that and something that I have been discussing, like I think I mentioned last time, is like what's the role EAB in the 2020s? Like what's the role of the EAB in this, in this decade or in this new? But the thing like I would like to propose to like,
We're like halfway through the decade.
what?
We're like halfway through.
Don't tell me that because my birthday aligned with numbers, so 2024 is 34, 2030, 40. Yeah, I think one group said that they would like to see the EAB as some sort of umbrella advisory board because climate now is so interlinked to housing and transportation, water. So I would like for council to rethink what the role of the AAB is now and how does it relate to the other boards. And that's what those are my ideas. So I think from here, I think we can start maybe grouping things like, because I think like,
Mine and Alex's ideas, I think, group pretty well into a similar like equitable access to energy and.
will that be electrification or is that different? Is that,
My proposal is not about increasing the amount of things that are electric, it was more about increasing the quality and ease of accessibility to
accessibility?
cheap, clean electricity as opposed to increasing increasing electrification of things, so.
But you can definitely, I think, put both of them under the same umbrella. I even have some other ideas of like, yeah, like, there's the, different vehicles, whatever, subsidies. But also like,
It's supplies.
how to make
I got a
those,
rag.
how to make our grid more resilient. Like, maybe it is one big solar panel somewhere, or maybe it's a bunch of distributed ones, when we have a problem with fire, or we have a grid that goes down during the summer or the winter, how does the city still get electricity? I don't know about if you heard about the Texas thing a couple of years ago where, their grid went down and there were people without power for.
There's actually some really interesting things that you can do with like kinetic batteries. This is a whole side tangent, and it's not something necessarily that I think would be a great project for the city, but it would be really cool if the city could do like some large kinetic battery.
Well, I mean, there are things that can be done.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I also said like that could fall in like emerging technologies and like asking the city to explore.
Yeah.
But just actually, before we move on, do you want to like give your overall opinion here? Like,
Sure you want me to do that?
well, let's be sure that we're still going in the right path.
Sure. I could offer some observations if it's helpful. And first of all, I really just want to appreciate all of you and your creativity and going through this process. It's a tricky one, right? It's tricky because it's easy to go right into the tactics and it's hard to separate like kind of the policy level guidance to elected officials to then kind of filter down. You're looking at, well, here's kind of what the end state that we're trying to create, which I think is absolutely right. What I want to try to help with is balance, as I started my comments with, are what are those things that could fall kind of as work plan items versus the things that, council are like, well, that's great. What are we supposed to do with that? How do we make that happen? So a couple of observations, I guess, if I could share. And I really like, and certainly, please don't take any of my comments as negative at all. It's just to be complimentary. And I actually really like that I could speak, it feels nice anyway, that I think a lot of the priorities that we have as a department fit very nicely and connect with the things that you all are talking about here. So maybe I can start, Greg. I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about yours. I really like the idea of how we can be more effective in our engagement overall. You mentioned a couple of tactics that we have out there right now. One of the things that the city has done is expanded the role of the engagement and belonging office. So it's really trying to find new ways to engage when people are just kind of like, I'm too busy to do anything, right? I'm worried about getting my kids to school and I'm getting food on the table, and I'm not going to go to a public meeting. That's not important to me. But how do we really continue to be out there, not only in a way that helps people feel like they are part of creating a solution, but also know what's going on? And Henan, you made this comment, and I know this is a real issue, that our programs are very, very deep and broad, but not many people know about them. We don't do a very good job of connecting people to the services and programs that are out there. And so sometimes I may come off as defensive, like, yeah, we're doing that, but people don't know we're doing that. So I just want to emphasize and appreciate that point. The food systems, you and I had this conversation about the food systems, and it's one that I'm kind of intrigued to think about. Again, always going into what problem are we trying to solve. I think you identified a couple of things there, and it would be an area that would touch a lot of different departments. I feel like the time framing is probably good to relaunch. The city had done some good work around. Alex, I'm sorry, I'm not looking at you. I feel bad that I have my shoulder to you.
You're fine.
So there is a little bit of architecture in place, and that's something that could potentially get kickstarted or restarted in that way. A lot of great connections to different departments work, as I said.
Was the circular economy study, the one that that was presented to us a few months ago, was that concluded?
The metabolic study?
No, there was like a circular economy thing,
Yes.
right? Was that metabolics?
Yeah, so the company was Metabolic, sorry, the
Oh,
firm
okay,
is
okay.
Metabolic. I do it shorthand, sorry about that. Yeah, so that's the Circular Boulder plan that looks at a number of things, but from the food systems perspective, it's really looking at food waste. It's looking at things like regenerative ag, creating new opportunities for locally sourced and produced food. So all really good stuff. I think what you're talking about is broader than that. There's a lot of dimensions to be explored in terms of food systems. On the energy stuff, Alex, I really appreciated kind of your exploration of like energy generation opportunities. There's a lot that we could kind of fit in there. The one challenge that we have always faced, and we have done so many studies of like every single parcel of land in and around Boulder that would be compatible and a good use for large scale solar and community solar. Open space is a challenge because in order to do anything on open space, it has to be a compatible use. Solar is specifically not a compatible use. So that property would have to be disposed of effectively, and it would have to then be overseen by another entity or another department. It's a very, very difficult thing to do.
Is it like a charter issue? What
It
is
is, it's an open space charter issue.
Okay.
And we run into that a lot when it comes to other types of uses that we think might be good for sustainability, resilience, and climate issues. Solar being one, thinking different practices around regenerative ag is another one. So that's always an issue. So one opportunity could be looking at the charter. And it would be a very hard thing to do, but that could be something to say, could we start to look at some of the broader policies, whether it be the charter, whether it be, and I want to link this to SmartMix too, looking at all of our kind of land use to ensure that it is, that we are removing as many restrictions for really important sustainability objectives. That could be something. Comp plan is another great thing that's coming up and a great vehicle for the board to be considering that could be really updated, looking at our land use policies to make sure that we're doing what we need to do. And, you know, it would be challenging, but, you know, it could be a thing. And I bring this up because what we have realized is that, you know, we've invested in a good number of large scale solar projects, but they're not even in Boulder County, they're in Weld County because that's where the property is the cheapest. It is directly going into the system and offsetting use, all good stuff. One thing that I would let you all know about that I think is a really important upcoming opportunity that we've really pushed Excel to do, was an idea that we created. I'm gonna try not to go too far down this rabbit hole, is how do we actually develop solar when we don't have a tax appetite as a nonprofit entity, right? So we don't get to monetize tax credits as a city. So oftentimes local governments will partner with somebody to develop solar and then we lease. That's changing a little bit with some of the IRA and some of the recent federal legislation, which I think is helpful. The one thing that is challenging is if you do community solar, then you have to have a subscriber organization manage all of the subscriptions. We are not set up to do that as a city. We're doing it with Ponderosa because there isn't that many subscribers, and we're working with Grid Alternatives as the subscriber organization and manager of that project. And I'm certainly not shutting down the idea, but I think it's a great way to nest this idea of kind of what you were describing. How do we look at driving down the cost of solar, cost per watt? How do we look at accessibility to make sure everybody has the ability to benefit from solar? And it could be a variety of things. Looking at all of our on-site opportunities, looking at our package of incentives, looking at large-scale solar where it makes sense, community solar connecting with entities like Boulder Housing Partners and other low-income agencies. So I think there could be a really good package there around energy burden. And energy burden is just the amount of money that people spend towards energy-related services and costs. And solar is a great levelizer in there. So just some like off-the-cuff remarks. And again, not trying to shut anything down. I think it's a really interesting idea. A thought about smart regs, if you'll indulge me just another couple minutes. Sorry, you opened this door, by the way. Blame you. I think it's a really interesting a really interesting time to think about aligning a good number of the city's code and regulation and orient them towards the same kind of outcome. Right now, there's a little bit of a patchwork, right? So smart regs is our regulation around energy efficiency and rental housing. Right now, you're going to see this next month too. We're upgrading or updating our energy code, and then we're embarking on a big discussion about an embodied carbon element of our building code. And then we have a number of codes that kind of move forward in different sequences. There could be a really we started the conversation with our colleagues in planning, which is how do we start to take this whole package of code and regulation and align it in a way that really gets to the outcomes that we want around sustainability, around climate, around resilience. What would that look like? And I think it kind of pulls in a little bit of what you were saying, Greg, too. So that could be a really interesting thing to advise the council. Take a look at your regulation. What would it take to really be aggressive in many ways, understanding the balance of equity and cost and all of the things, but that could be very powerful, including the comp plan, because again, this is a 10-year opportunity that we have coming up next year to really orient that comp plan in a different way.
And when in the year is the comp plan coming to us?
It's likely the first look at it will be later in this year for an update next year. So we're just starting to kind of pull things together in an interdepartmental way, making sure that we have a role to play in that. But it's a very, very powerful piece of regulation that guides all of the codes for the city and the county. So again, I think a very powerful thing to think about there. What else did I want to say? That might have been enough. Yeah, sorry, last thing. This idea of land use, I think is also very intriguing. We've talked about it. I think just starting to scratch at this. We as a department have been thinking about this intersectionality between things like transportation, like density, and really starting to orient and understand what we mean when we draw that connection between land use and climate issues. So whether that's some big analysis, whether it's having council really start to think about this issue of density in a different way from a climate perspective, I think is a really powerful one. And then just so you are aware, if these seeds anything with you all, some things that I know we have in motion that are kind of in that 2-year-ish timeframe. One is really looking at building out and starting to reboot our overall city resilience approach. It's a really important one. We did a lot of great work. Last month, we talked about, and I shared out with you our resilience strategy from 2016. There's a lot of evergreen information in there. I think we're at a really interesting point to think about how do we re-energize that work? How do we update our resilience work? And how do we make sure that we're actually taking the actions that could be identified in a resilience strategy? That's a bit of a 2-year work plan item. And then as part of that, and maybe a little bit of a subset of that, is we're looking at what it would take to develop a community heat strategy. So it's how do we think about heat, both from a technology standpoint, but through an equity focus, through a nature-based solutions focus. There are a lot of things that the city could do to really start to identify opportunities that forecast what we're going to be facing with more days of extreme heat. So those are just some things that kind of popped into my mind that were triggered by some of these notes. But overall, I think there's some great theming, I think some great bucketing, and whatever I and our team can do to be supportive here.
Just to add on to that, I read through the resiliency. I actually wrote it down as the second idea. I totally forgot about it. Because the document, I don't know if anyone else read it, there's a lot of really good, like, actionable, the city's gonna do this, and it's very much focused holding equity at the center. So kind of hit on some of the things you're talking about, grid resiliency and kind of access to green power. I mean, not specifically, but and I asked Jonathan, I was like, how do we find out what happened? Like, did we do these cool ideas that the city laid out? And we don't know. And so I don't know, it sounds like you already rebooting it, but the other idea I had was to tell council, we need a resiliency strategy and we need to prioritize it. And I think it hits on a lot of these issues, a lot of equity issues when it comes to climate. So I'm just also think we should add that to our potential.
It would be great for resiliency, great big kinetic battery.
Maybe, I don't know. But I
That
do
falls into
think-
the Excel partnership.
Yeah, I think so. Excel would be thrilled to build one of those.
Yeah. I think the
Be
specific
surprised.
there is they should update what they've done around it and have a real.
So actually part of going back to that original plan and getting a status of where we're at
Yeah,
with all of the things
yeah,
would be part of a new review of okay, what do we do now? What's the biggest bang for a buck? What can we do to be resilient and sustainable?
Well, I think I would like to put maybe 3 buckets, combine some of these ideas into 3 buckets, and then within the main bucket, put sub items. Because I think they can still fit in a 1-page letter. If we put 3 main topics, and then
Or like a paragraph from middle school.
There you go.
yeah,
and I'll just say I'm personally good at not everything's and being more specific with higher leverage ideas than trying to include everything.
I feel there's a lot of overlapping here though, because this
Yeah.
one, for example, relates to land use, and it's why are solar arrays incompatible with open space, for example? It's that's something that we can explore. Then these 2 relate to access and equity, which kind of ties up with smart arrays and students. Land use also relates to that.
There's definitely some topic areas we can put down there, or some more specific examples in our letter.
Yeah. And I want to see if not everything fits is okay, but at least to find the common themes of what we want to say.
Yeah, I think one of the big ones is equity or equitable access.
Let's call it environmental justice and equitable access.
Yeah.
supporting those in need. As well.
And I assume that we are trying to give council actionable steps rather than just describing what in general we want to see change, that it would be most effective if we can say, we request this, this, or this. Is that correct?
I
Yeah,
would say
yeah.
that's true.
I think that that would be sort of an ideal, but that can also be a little bit. I feel like it would be more productive to give general things that we want done without like, here's the exact 10 steps we want you to do, because those can get, like, those work right in a vacuum, but the way that they apply towards actual political work can get pretty messy in that translation. And so I think it would be most productive to provide a sort of overarching topic and then some vaguely actionable items with more of a direction than steps. And
I would
then let them
I
run with that.
think I agree with that because we don't really know the exact steps.
Right,
But I think we can point the direction.
Yeah. so give like general actionable directions.
And I want to see where this takes us. I mean, like, I think, I'm trying to guide us towards like a one-page letter. But I wouldn't mind if that letter had links or something that is like, hey, here is like a little bit more, like to a whole paragraph for each item. If that makes sense, like, if they want to read it, then read it, if they catch their attention, but it's like.
Right.
I want something that is, like a cover page that has what we want to say, and then we can work on, depending on how this kind of ends up looking, provide more information with like steps and directions, and it's like, okay, if you're interested in this is kind of how we envision this working.
Mhm.
Because that won't fit in a one-page letter, but
No.
it can fit in like a sort of like a one-page cover plus like a little memo kind of deal. That's what I don't know. So, okay, so environmental justice and equitable access, so like we just kind of like some of that. Jonathan, you said smart regs is land use?
What I was suggesting, thanks, Hernan, what I was suggesting is, rather than, that could be one specific example that we teed up for a look later on this year, perhaps next year. I think it fits into environmental justice for sure. But what I was suggesting is packaging up a recommendation for council to take a good hard look at its suite of policy and code and ensure that that code is matching up with our commitment towards equity, sustainability, resilience, and climate action. And I think it would lead us to different places, not only in terms of when we update those codes, but how we go about that update. So it'd be looking at all of our policies to say, let's look at it through the equity lens. What would it mean? How would it look different? Same way with our energy code, same way with our building code, same way with the whole suite of codes that we oversee. So I guess I was just suggesting, I think smart regs is just one of a whole package that are going to be moving forward over the next couple of years. That all of that should really be aligned around certain outcomes that I think you all can signal to say, hey, look, we are your environmental advisory board. You need to make sure that these codes are achieving these particular outcomes when they come to you. You should be asking questions. How does this advance these outcomes that we believe are important?
I almost feel like that and like a desire to have more electricity or whatever it is that we come up with, like these are factors within, like, if we can come up with actionable things that like, yeah, have the city look for, a way to have more electricity. And we want to look at it under that lens. And we also want to look at it under sustainability and resilience.
Okay.
Lens.
So how will we, so I think that changes how we will organize the letter then. Like, so what are you saying? How will we organize the letter then?
Well, I think like having a thing of title of have more energy resilience or energy sustainability. And then come up with an idea of, okay, let's have the city look for where, either look at code and land use changes or look for land that's existing, situation.
I think maybe taking it even broader, kind of so like. Plus one of what Jonathan said of like. Can the city make decisions on everything that we make decisions on around, especially around codes and regulations with a climate lens? If they're not doing that already. And the climate lens is already what's laid out. Been laid out in the climate action plan and kind of through the. What the work they've been doing.
I mean, so with that, I think the question that. What are we trying to give council with this letter? Are we trying to give them a like? I don't like the word manifesto, but like a like, here is the topics you should be keeping in mind as you approach all of your decisions going into the next couple of years. Or are we trying to give them, here are the things that we think you should actively change? Because I'm hearing some competition between the two ideas. And I think that either one would be good as long as we pick one and don't try and do both and fail to do either.
Well,
I think-
I also want to give them direction, right? Some direction as to where to go for the next 2 years.
I heard Alex.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, just, I think one of Hernan's suggestions kind of bridged the gap between both when he suggested that council kind of reevaluate the role of the EAB because it does overlap so much with so many boards. Is the role of the EAB a siloed off singular board that makes independent suggestions, decisions, recommendations, etc.? Or do we kind of reallocate it such that it is an element within every other board and decision making, and it falls under that umbrella framework where we are approaching every decision with energy and energy justice in mind for everything? So I guess that could be a way to bridge that gap, is like Hernan suggested, asking the question of what is the role of the EAB as we move forward.
This might be a good thing to bring up. I think it might be interesting to explore what would happen if we tried to make the EAB a quasi judicial board. With a more similar purview to, or more similar function to more of a planning board kind of thing, where we have oversight over the other advisory boards in terms of how things are affecting the climate. Is that something that
Or
we
at least-
should consider putting in the letter, or is that a wildly different thing?
I mean, I guess I would
I think
kind of
it's-
have a counter proposal.
go ahead, you were doing first, sorry.
Counter proposal of that we come up with. Along with the climate initiative department of like, like. What are targets that transportation has to try to meet? Or some way of like, we're not in control of it, but through. The city's own internal processes, has to look at a lens of how does it match up for the climate? And like, okay, what do they need to do? What does this department need to do? So we don't have to get into the, specific management of any board or any department, but that there's like, if the city has this alignment of like being carbon neutral and okay, what are the next things that we're gonna be? We need to be energy sufficient, we need to be fire resistant, we need to be sustainable, and let the processes work within the city to make each department do, line up with any policies, goals, and then we, as the board, would just make recommendations. Oh, we think the transportation could do better, and here's some things that we've heard about.
How does it work right now? Like say the transportation, say somebody's building a new. I know this could build a new road, but doing something that impacts transportation or something. Do they have to meet with you or climate emissions? Like, is there integration of like other things going on in the city and like you having impact on that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So really interesting conversation. So the answer to your question is no. Though what I will say is, so keep in mind that most departments have a master plan. The master plan is then adopted or approved by city council. The city council at that time will look at the master plan and say, does this hit kind of the culture, the philosophy that we envision for whatever period that master plan is intended to serve, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it might be. So as an example, the transportation master plan, which was just recently reviewed and approved, council looked at that and said, okay, how does this plan govern, and what is the vision that it lays out for how we think about transportation in terms of the construction, in terms of the design and the planning and the modality and all of the stuff. And that's where you see things then kind of filter down into work plans, right? So the policy is we want to design towards 50-minute neighborhoods, and we have targets around reducing vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, and reducing emissions by X%. So that's all laid out in the master plan. What doesn't happen though is really interface between the departments kind of laterally. And that's where we've been, I think, as a team of directors led by Nuria, where, and I'm pulling in something you just kind of prompted for me. One of the things that you could reflect is just, we are now starting to really lean into what's called the SARE framework. It's the acronym is Sustainability, Equity, and Resilience. You should have a link to this. I think we've talked about it previously. The SARE framework is the guiding document that sits under the comp plan, but basically says, here's how we are going to do our work as a city. And you go through that SARE framework, and there are things like safe, there's accessible, there's environmentally sustainable, there are whatever 5 different things, and then actions underneath each one of those. So that SARE framework is really intended to be that guiding philosophy that all departments orient towards. Greg, I think that's kind of what you were referring to, which is transportation, or call it IT, as they are going to go out and do a thing or buy a thing. They map it back to the SARE framework to make sure that it's hitting those marks and that we're doing what we should be doing under our sustainability, equity, and resilience framework. So one possibility in terms of a recommendation is just to continue to build on, continue to build on the great work that the city's doing under the SARE framework, and ensure that maybe we are going and reviewing plans for consistency with the SARE framework. I'm just trying to kind of.
Do you think it's a good framework? Does it really capture the climate goals?
Yeah, I do. I mean, we helped create it probably in 2017. It's been updated, and now one of the things that is coming from that, and I shared a little bit about this, and I can't share more because it's not really out there for review yet, is the city's moving in the direction of a strategic plan, which will be like a 3-year plan. And that's going to help kind of match up with council priorities. So again, your recommendation as a board is you're going to send it to all council members. They're going to go into their retreat. One council member or more may say, kind of a number of priorities for our work moving forward that are additive to what we're already doing. And I really think this idea that the EAB has suggested, which is whatever, this should be something that we as council take up as a priority, which means they are going to be monitoring it. They are going to be moving it forward. Some of it may be pushing, directing Nuria to direct staff to do the thing. But council is going to be doing some of the thing too.
So I think.
I talked too long.
It's just something that would get boring.
Let's try this again. I think what I'm hearing is maybe frame the letter as what does it look like for council and the decisions they make if they made those decisions through the lens of environmental justice and equity, and equitable access to clean energy. And what does that mean in terms of like what would that mean in terms of like the smart regs, access to energy, land use, like how can we frame all these issues such that they can be viewed through that lens? Yes, yeah, Yay, nay? I see doubts in your face.
I don't know if that is going to be the most productive way to frame what we're trying to give to the council. I think that it will be a lot more productive to go with a more similar structure to what we were looking at earlier, which was we have some overarching themes that we want council to be considering, and then some general directions that we think that they could take those themes and not try and apply it to things that they're working on, not try and apply it to interdepartmental work, just this is what we as the EAB think is important to be looking at and working on, and here are the things that we have isolated that are important to us. However, here are these general frameworks and overarching topics that you can apply in whatever way is most productive or most helpful in the moment, and not try and like trying to be as general as possible while still giving a direction. Because council is not going to be able to do all of the things exactly as we want them, and us saying, here's how you should do the things that you might be facing is also not going to be super helpful to them. And so instead, giving a direction and a framework that they can bend and shape as is applicable is going to be a lot more productive,
So what will be the?
I think, at least.
No, I mean, that's good. What will be the architecture of the letter there? Like, what will be the structure of the letter? Like, what's the introduction, the meat, and the conclusion?
I mean, like I said earlier, write it like a middle school paragraph of, yeah, here's what we talked about, here are the things that are important to us. Here are the things that we thought were important for you to look at and consider, and then dive into a couple specific examples of things that we touched on, be that, pull from whatever is up here of, accessibility to clean energy, and, find ways to build increased solar spaces and find ways to increase broadcasting, but that's more of a departmental issue than it is a council issue. And, figure out the specifics that we would like to see, but still leave in general, here's what you guys should be looking at. Here's what we think you guys should keep in mind. And the direction that we think you should be headed.
So can I, based on what you're saying and what I'm hearing you ask, recommend that we talk about our desire for equitability. We talk about, sustainability and resilience. And then we could talk about okay, city council, under this, the grouping of equity, we could talk about some food, here's how we can increase not only equitability, but also resilience. And maybe it's coming up with an idea for having more food for, so that there's in times of, tough times, maybe we have more food access in Boulder as well as more electricity. And then we also talk about, okay, we want to look at what are the structures that are hindering progress. And so bring together a group, or, give some money to hire the right, to look at building codes, land use, what prevents us from putting electricity up. And also in there, talk about we want to have resilience through trying to provide more electricity for the city, for the I don't know if it's just for the city or just for all of the public, but,
So you're saying you'll try to find the common themes then, is what you're saying?
at least talk about how the different ideas that we're presenting have these common threads. If you look at as a city that we're trying to be more, equitable, and we're trying to be more resilient, and we're trying to do this, here's these ideas that we can put together, and I think it's fine to go and say, hey, city council, maybe make a nudge for providing a framework to really redo the sustainability, equity, and resilience framework. And find out what we did, what we didn't do that we should, like.
I'm not gonna disagree that that's a good thing to do, but I don't necessarily think that that is super within our purview. Like that feels more of like an interdepartmental thing, and I'm sure that department heads and Mary are gonna be working, or are gonna be doing basically exactly that of like, how did this serve us well, how did this not serve us, but that I don't think is what the letter to council is for.
I'm sorry, I mean, interrupt. Maybe this would help. In terms of kind of tone and structure, I would offer this, and I only offer this because I've seen a good number of letters come from the board, some that are effective and others that are not so effective. The not so effective letters have been, I think, good in terms of intent, but they lacked specificity in terms of like a council member saying, I don't know what to do this. Of course, philosophically, I agree with what you're saying, but I don't know what to do with that. Like, you should prioritize climate justice. Great.
What does that mean?
What does that mean in the next 2 years for me as a council member and us as a body? The effective letters I have seen have a little preamble about, we've organized this letter around this. Looking ahead to the next 2 years, we think that this council should really lean into these issues of climate justice, equity, and I'm just like using the words like, and because these are really critical to our community, these are priorities of many of the departments right now. They are anchored within the SARE framework. Specifically, here are 3 things that we think would be really good topics for you to be thinking about. Relaunching a study and an analysis and a program around food systems. And so they can draw the connection like, oh, food systems, because I see, yeah, it fits under this rubric of, it supports all of this stuff. I may just say food systems. Accessible and affordable energy to everyone. Not, again, just making up words. So that, and then maybe it's something around resilience, maybe it's something about code, whatever you all want to put in there. Maybe it's like 3 bullet points with a few sentences underneath that says, here's why we think this is a priority for you. And you don't need to do the mapping back to kind of that preamble language. Then I think a council member can be like, great, I see what you all stand for. Here are 3 things that are actionable that I can bring in as a 2-year priority for me as a council member.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I'm gonna at least clarify for my verbiage, and I don't know if it'll be helpful for anyone else, but it's specificity in goals as opposed to specificity in action, right? It's like, we're not giving them action item. We're not giving them a like step-by-step, here's the 10 things you need to do in the next year. We're giving them this is a topic you think you should work on. Here are the sort of like long-term goals, and here's the general direction to get there. And not like, we're not building the road, we're designing where we think the road should go.
We're essentially giving like objectives and targets, right? Kind of,
That's the way that I'm phrasing it in my brain, and I don't know if that's helpful to other.
However you all want to do this, it's totally up to the board. I'll use the food system again, just because it happens to be eye level with me every time I look over at the board. So it would be, rather than laying out the prescriptive path, it would be, look, food systems and food access is really critical in our community. It's going to become even more so because of the threats of climate and affordability and all of the things. The city had done a little bit of work on this. We advise that council take this up a priority and reboot its priority and focus on developing safe, accessible, whatever, some words around food systems. Boom.
Right.
Got it.
That's it.
Right. We're being architects, not builders.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. I'm
I
down.
like how you phrased it in the introduction paragraph. Can you repeat that?
I took notes.
You're being funny, aren't you? You're being
And we have a
funny.
recording.
Because I like it. I think like it's a good the preamble for like everything else.
I think we also, like, we have a very good council this year for
Yeah.
our board specifically.
I agree.
A lot of the board is super motivated to get good climate work done.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that we are one of the more.
Yeah.
On the balance of letters that you've seen, we want to be on the more productive ones
Yeah.
this year.
So Jonathan, you said you're already looking into this, so there's no, do you think there's no need to mention it again? Or you? Because I think it's more breaks us up for the review soon, right, isn't it, anyway, or not?
You're talking about the land use issue specifically?
Yeah, but I think we can, I mean, combine all this into like code, right, like.
Yeah, so I guess if I was advising on this, which
You are.
maybe I am.
Which is great.
The package there is, you know, we're looking at this 2-year window. There are a whole number of. There's a big package of regulation that the city oversees, right? And it doesn't, it's not just our housing and land use codes. There's a lot of regulation that continues to come before council for updates. The advice I think the board could give is taking a really hard look at the package of regulation that the city oversees as it comes before that body, before council, to ensure that all of that code is aligned around and oriented towards the SARE framework as an example, or towards the outcomes that you believe that have been put in the preamble up top, which is how do we make our community more resilient? How do we anchor into environmental justice, so forth and so on. Because that, I think, is a really good thing that's the right level for them, because they're going to be taking input from different departments, bringing forward different codes. And if they were thinking, oh yeah, we need to make sure, like, never really thought that we could use that code for that outcome.
Right.
So that would be the right level to match up and map the body of regulation. It's one of the things that the cities have power over, right, is the
Right.
regulation.
So I kind of see it as two things. One is a preamble. What are the lenses at which we are encouraging city council to look at the following, and then give them some ideas, you know,
Yeah.
like of actionable, like, let's look, you know, let's review the SARA, SER,
SCR, yeah.
SCR, you know.
Well, that's not, I don't think that's pretty new, and that's, I wouldn't suggest that that's kind of a guiding document for internal. But then council is starting to map to that too.
Sure,
Yeah.
yeah, and like equitability, I think I would want to include, like, encouraging the city council to look at how do we increase outreach and democracy. You know, as a category, electricity, you know, equitability or access to whatever. Some titles like that.
And I'm happy to help offline too, if you want to, you know, this idea of the package of codes, like such as things that are upcoming, such as the energy code, the building code, and in 2025 specifically, the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. Those could be things that you could give specifics that they should really be watching for,
Yeah.
to align.
When you mentioned like the role of heat, would that fall under this regulation?
No,
No.
no, that falls into a little bit of the additional planning. So I mentioned, you know, there's other plans that I think need some love and care. One is the reboot of the resilience strategy, another being an analysis around this land use connection, which is a really big kind of connector. And then the third is something that we're starting to work on as a department, and that is a citywide heat strategy, extreme heat strategy.
Would that go under the resiliency or is that separate?
Probably,
Okay.
but it's one of the plans that would be designed.
Should we have a resilience bucket then?
I think it's rebooting resiliency efforts. That touches so much on equity that we've been talking about.
Yeah, there's a big social resilience piece of that, which kind of tugs in the climate justice and equity piece.
Right.
So that was like sorry, what do you guys say, the heat study, right? What else was there?
A lot in the
Yeah,
document. I
there's a
think just
lot.
like kind of taking the framework that they have and
Big framework and document.
I think it's
Re-examine the
2000
framework that was already
it's 2016.
created
Yeah,
and revisit and see how it could be adapted for the.
yeah.
Will this be part of the resiliency then, like like making the community more resilient?
That's about access and equitability, it's not resilience.
So,
Also, I don't wanna lose, like, land use and transportation are some of the biggest climate levers, so I don't wanna lose these.
I think that there are going to be more and better opportunities to touch on those later. I don't think that those should be our priority for the letter. Like, you're correct, those are big, those are important, and they will be big climate issues.
Yeah.
We will have other opportunities to touch on in ways that are more concrete, I think. John, is that an accurate statement, do you think, Jonathan, that those are gonna be coming forward in more actionable ways than our letter to council?
Here's what I would anticipate, or what, again. Little bit of advice. I think focusing on the things that are unique to your voice is really important, right? When it comes to transportation, absolutely, it's important. It is absolutely essential. I can guarantee that this council is very, very aware, and I'm looking right at you because you know why, around transportation related emissions, transportation in general. We have TAB, the Transportation Advisory Board, is going to be submitting a letter. They are aligning around these overall objectives. I would say really speak with a unique voice on things that we know another board is not going to bring forward.
Yeah, so. The letter to council is the way for us as the EAB
Okay,
to talk about environmental issues. And so those have environmental aspects, but those will come before us when they're relevant.
okay,
As you know, the comp plan is going to come before us in some way, and we can talk about things in that as they are intersectional when it comes before us. For the letter to council, we want to keep it concise and clear and directed on very specifically environmental issues, I think.
I am helpful on that. Because I would like council to define that, like I wanna go to council and ask them, what is eco-friendly housing? I want them to be able to tell me that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that this is
Because that
not
is
the
something
space
that
to do
does
that.
get both sides, like fight over that in local politics, like, because
That is the main dividing line in both politics, yes.
yeah, so I want them to define like what's eco-friendly housing.
I agree. I think that the letter to council is not the space to do that. There will be
Yeah.
other spaces and other opportunities where it is more relevant.
I disagree on that. Because like maybe
I'm
like,
happy to be outvoted, but I think that our letter. will be
because like,
most-
what I'm concerned is like by then they come to us. This gonna make it lost in the conversation. That will be my only concern, like I wanted to know that beforehand, this is something we're thinking about. If you're gonna study this year. Can you please include this question in the conversation? But
I'm happy to be outvoted on this issue if you
I'm
would so
with- I'm
choose,
with
but I
you.
think that. Right now, that is not what is on council's
Well,
mind.
Can
And
I,
yeah, go ahead.
I think you're right. I think you're right. I think what we can do is maybe we can just all put down, here's the topics that we are thinking about, like just real quick, one line. And then we can just all vote on, like, what are the three most things I think are important? What are the three, and then pick the ones that are the biggest items. And we submit that with a paragraph of what's important to us. And we don't have to include, we can put in there like, here's all the things that are important to us. And here's the three most important action items that I think we're recommending.
Again, the voice that I'm trying to provide here is more. I think I have the most experience with the interplay between our space and the actual application of how it works in the political space. And so I'm trying to stay in more of a like advisory directional kind of space, and so I'm happy to pitch in on any of that, but in terms of how these letters get consumed in council, those are gonna get completely lost. Council gets, how many boards are there? 15, 20? 20? They get 20 letters all at the same time that they talk about a short retreat where it is one of the items in a long list of other things.
Yeah.
So we want to keep the list of things that we're providing them short. We want to give them, like, we want to remove as much legwork for them as possible. In terms of how do I take this general concept into a design and a plan? And we want to keep it concise and clear and just here are the big picture topics, and here are a couple items within those big picture topics that we think are important. And you can do with that what you will. But a list of 15 different issues that we rattle out in a list in some sentence in the letter is gonna get completely lost.
That's not what
So whatever we decide, I'm happy to go with, but I think that will not be the most effective.
So I think like what I'm advocating is to tell council to, like the direction I would like them to take is to explore the relationship between housing density, transportation, and the environment, and how that applies to the land use. So it'll just be like a direction that I would like them to take in the next 2 years. Like, I think that's something that we kind of need to study and answer, because it relates so much to our local politics, to our housing priorities, and it does relate to the environment. So I would just like to give them that nudge, so they know that is something that is important to us, and I feel like they should at least, like, I don't know the answer to that, I don't know what departments are involved, but it's something that I would like them to kind of, I think if you say land use, that's gonna get their attention, because it's something that definitely defines our local politics. So, like, just give that direction such that they can, start go to Nuri and be like, hey, this is something we should look at. What do we need to hire consultants? What departments will get involved in this?
I mean, I think my question would be, we can't just say you should keep environmental issues in mind when we're talking about land use. I think if we're going to include that, it should be around like, what is, like, very specifically, what about land use and environmentalism and that intersection do we want them to keep in mind? We can't just say, when you're considering land use issues in the next 2 years, please keep in mind the environmental impacts of the potential, whatever. But like, it can be like, hey, we think that we should find a way to change the charter so that we can section off some spaces of public space, open space for solar farms. Like, that is a very like umbrella under land use, but I think that we should avoid from just going, hey, land use and environmentalism. I obviously would be better worded than that, but again.
But I don't think like, I don't want just like land use and environmentalism, but it's like, because if transportation sends a letter that is also about land use,
Mhm.
and then we send a letter that is like about environmentalism, like, I think, they can start seeing that there's this connection within land use and all these different things. So it's like, they could take action and like, try to involve different departments on like defining, policies around it, even as they think about the code and stuff.
Yeah, I do feel pretty confident this particular council is certainly thinking about that relationship already.
Yeah, and
I can agree on that.
and again, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying I don't think it would be effective.
Sure.
And that like, I'm not trying to convince you that it would be a bad idea, or correction. I like, if that's something you want to do and it's something that the rest of the board wants to do, that's great. I just don't think that that's going to be the most effective use of the letter.
Okay.
If we decide that that's what we want to do with it, I'm happy to go with that, but I just don't think that will be effective.
Let's vote. Yes,
What do we have to
Wait,
vote on?
what are we voting on here?
I guess including land use in the letter.
Well, is it Should we vote on what the third bucket is?
Wait,
I think the third bucket was the umbrella thing, right, for the AV, like, what is that part of like?
Feels like that could just be a memo. I have no idea though.
I don't even understand what buckets are looking for.
No, I mean, like, I wanted to see, like, if we want to include land use.
So looking at regulations
Yeah,
and
as,
sustainability
and
and
the sustainability.
resilience, that stuff.
And then removing the resiliency efforts. There are two bullet points so far.
I think that talking about equitability and increasing accessibility to clean energy would be a much more effective and convincing third bucket to put on there.
Yeah, so I think it's between that, food systems and EIB or land use.
The role of EAB and land use. I also,
I mean, I would really encourage, I mean, I would definitely want to vote on outreach
Okay,
personally.
I think,
So that's why I'm like saying, like,
I think that the role of EAB and
I think outreach.
outreach. Role of EAB is an entirely separate conversation. And I think it is an extended one, and I think it needs to be revisited. Because the way that the EAB is not serving the goals of what I've got a whole spiel in it, but and I think that outreach is incredibly important. I also think that that is not a council issue, that is a department issue. And so we can work with the Climate Initiative Department to increase outreach and have different ideas for outreach. I think that telling council that we think that the outreach that needs to be done around our climate issues is not going to be helpful.
Yeah.
I
agree with that.
I think that is something we can work with Jonathan and the rest of the department on about outreach.
Yeah, I think outreach should be something we probably like Jonathan about. So like.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
I'm just raising my hand to offer a comment that may be helpful, because I want you all to not feel paralyzed that you're gonna lose something off this list if it isn't voted into the letter. So just some things that I would say here. I'd like to offer maybe either for my department or also the Office of Engagement and Belonging to come to the board and talk about what we are doing around overall community engagement. And maybe we can engage with you and hear your ideas of how we can do better specifically and kind of come up with those ideas. Because I agree that it'll be hard for a council member to know what to do with that recommendation. They're gonna say, well, let's just pitch that. We have a whole office that works on that stuff. So we don't need to do anything as a council around that. And so I would just offer that we can put that on the calendar and make it a topic to engage with you all as a board to think about how we could do better in that space, if that would be an option you'd like. The other one, I don't want to lose some of the conversation, Alex, that you brought in, some of your ideas and this idea around accessibility and kind of our energy systems. I would like an opportunity maybe to explore with you all, talk through some of our existing programs, talk about where some of the barriers exist, give you an update on some of those things. As an example, Alex, I wanted to tell you, in the good news category, we've actually exceeded that 100 megawatt 2030 target. We just need to update the website. But I think there's still a lot more we could be doing there. We're pretty much in charge of that as a department. And so that feels like more of a, hey, let's talk to you all about what we are doing. Where can we do better? Is it more around rebates and incentives? That feels better suited for a good conversation with us. I think another one of those things, you go to council with like, hey, we should care about this stuff. They're going to say, yeah, we care about that stuff.
Right.
Have you talked to those guys over there? They're the ones that are in charge of that. Go talk to them. So in that way, I don't want it to be circular, and I don't want you all to feel like, oh, that was kind of worthless. We could have just talked to the climate initiative department. So I would say you could take those off, but I don't want to tell you to do that. That is totally your choice to do so. So that leaves, I guess, in my mind, thinking about how to package up something around land use. What is the thing you want council to do with that? And you can put it on a topic you all can nuance that and figure out how to massage language. And then I think the issue of the food systems is still there for you to consider too. that sits at the right level, which is, hey, reboot this work that the city was started several years ago and it hasn't really been doing anything for a while.
I would agree with that, because I was gonna also remind us of the food systems that I think in regards to what Brooke has been saying, finding effective ways to actually have council take some sort of actionable steps within their purview. The fact that we had a food systems kind of program, if you will, that can be reevaluated, rebooted, and analyzed of what went well, maybe what things can be improved. I think that's something that naturally sits there that council can kind of grab onto, look at, and understand their path of what they may be able to do moving forward with kind of simple suggestions and nudges from us.
Wait, so what do we think that their bucket should be?
Alex just mentioned food systems. I'm obviously interested in that, but I don't know what other people.
Again, food systems falls in that space where we can go, as Alex mentioned, hey, look, there's that thing you already have, let's just go back to that and keep doing that and figure out why that isn't working and fix it.
And think about it, that just that coming from us, they'll be like, oh yeah, that is a climate issue. They'll have to be like, oh yeah, food, it's climate, and kind of. That doesn't always sit, I think, with people.
You can do 4. You don't have to.
Yeah, we could do 4.
There's no
Yeah.
magic. You can put as many as you want.
Yeah,
Just saying.
and then process wise, since we're,
I
Are we
like to
thinking
do
like-
3, I like 3.
oh, sorry, what?
I prefer to do 3 items.
Yeah, 3 things. I assume like, we'll like draft, are we allowed to work in a Google Doc? As
Yeah, I
long as
think-
we're
I
both
think
not
it's,
in it.
As long as it's like, I think 2 at a time or something like that. So we can
We
like.
can't violate open meeting laws in Google Docs.
Okay.
That,
We don't have
that
to
will
write
need
this
to
in
be
text.
worked out.
I think what you said about the memo for this, I think maybe that's right. There should be a memo.
Yeah, I totally agree that it's worth.
That needs to be an entirely separate conversation because there is a lot to talk about there and or at least I think that there's a lot to talk about in that issue and
You
like.
seem to know, what do you recommend?
Quick question. What did our
Yeah.
non-circle? I just can't read the board at all.
So that about the changing role of
Neither can I.
the EAB into the modern day.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on it and we don't have time to get into them right now. But it is definitely, I think, a longer conversation about how the EAB does not meet frequently enough nor have enough power to actually have any kind of influence in the way that to the degree in which the environmental issues are so intersectional with everything. We as a board do not have the power or the time to adequately shape how that is working, and that needs to be revisited, I think.
I agree with that. Because it's something we can discuss
But
later.
I think that needs to be a longer conversation.
Because there's also a relationship between like, talk and we meet,
Yeah.
like, just recruiting people as well. We
Yeah.
had we had issues with that this
So we
year.
can take that offline to another time, right?
Yeah.
One another meeting, like. put it as-
That's
I would do
there-
Much,
there
much
should
for the
be-
board, and we can discuss that.
On the record
Try to
conversation.
write a separate memo to council on that. I am okay with removing, you've convinced me, I'm okay with removing the land use from one of the buckets. If anything, if I can fit it here, I'll try, with a lot of regulations, if it flows. Yeah, when we actually
Yeah.
write the paragraph, I can frame it as,
I think that's really good.
how do we regulate land use?
If there's a way to fit it in that works and is concise, great.
That's what I'm thinking. If I can do it, I'll try. I'll try to see if I can do it. Because I feel like there's some relationship there. I don't need to make it its own bucket. So for the last bucket,
I think that.
you said this is something that it's already being, this is part of something that is already being studied or was worked on.
There was a person assigned to be the head of the food systems. I don't think they've done it.
The only thing is like, what are food systems and city, like how do they intersect? That part is not clear to me yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a bunch of different ways that they intersect. So there's some land use stuff. Most of our like regenerative ag stuff, I think, is at the county level, but there's some open space lands, I think, that the city runs. So there's all the way through like growing to eating to selling. So like, how do we look holistically at food emissions? Looking at the consumption-based emissions is a big part of that. So looking at those categories, how do we reduce those numbers so that we can meet our goals? And how does that interact? So whether it's like local food is, I think what Jonathan's referring to as what was done before, is a real emphasis on local, organic. Then there's some debate on the emission side of that. And all the way to like, I don't know, I have lots of thoughts, like it's kind of like, what do restaurants serve, all sorts of stuff like that, but I don't think that's for us to decide. It's just to say, hey, this is our big bucket of climate emissions from the consumption-based standpoint that we have data on. How do we reduce this number and do it in a way that provides healthy, sustainable food to those people who need the most access to healthy, sustainable food, and make sure that they're getting it.
And
That's
the
kind
other,
of wide.
and the other one will be equitable access, right? That would be another bucket as well.
To energy,
Energy, like this, all this stuff is like within the rubric of equitable access.
energy, yeah,
Okay,
to clean energy specifically.
okay.
And I can send some more info on food stuff that I wrote up, but I didn't.
What do you guys think? What do you want to include in the third bucket? Because I think outreach we decided is more like departmental resilience. I think we're talking about that, providing some examples.
But we could also do two. I mean, we don't have to do three.
Isn't the Sarah?
I like to do three. I don't know. It just seems like
That's part of that falls under regulation and interdepartmental interactions.
sorry. Wait, what do you ask?
The
To Sarah.
sustainability.
Yeah, that would be
accountability.
regulations. So it's like,
So that's not one of the buckets.
It's not a bucket by itself.
but it's aligned. So basically, everything that's going to be like all the packages, all the codes, make sure they're aligned through the SARE framework. So there will be like frame everything within the.
So basically, we're not gonna tell city council to focus on it because it's already something gonna happen.
It is a new program in between department heads under the city, from my understanding, it is happening independent of city council.
What is the it in this?
Sarah,
And like city, code.
Well, those are different things. So the SARE framework is a guiding document that the city uses as a tool to map all of our investments, our programs, our policies to the sustainability, equity, and resilience outcomes. What we're talking about here is using that tool and ensure that we're using that tool as we update all of our package of codes that are going to be coming forward.
Yeah.
So the things that we know are coming this year and next year.
So I mean, the amount to which we should and can talk about Sarah is just say, hey, don't forget, Sarah, we think that is important to the environmental issues.
Yeah.
Cool.
So as I look at the smart regs, the regulations, the building codes, like look at it through this not new frame, sorry, this existing framework that is being.
I think you can frame however you want. You could say, emphasize these outcomes and all of your regulation and policy. You already have a tool that you should be using, council, as you look at these. That is the SARE framework. You should also look at all of these outcomes in a more holistic way. So you could massage that language. It feels like.
It doesn't need to be yeah.
So okay, so for the last bucket, we can do food systems, we can do equitable access, unless there's a way to mix those two. I think 3 items is digestible, like I think it's a number that people remember.
3 items is very digestible, yes.
So any references here? What do you guys think?
Food systems? I'm good with whatever, but.
Or like, what would be, I guess, if you had to,
I think that equitable access is something that can be a conversation by itself, that we can do at a separate time. I think that food systems is the one that most cleanly fits into our letter, and equitable access is a different conversation. I know Alex, both of our ideas fall under that equitable access, but I think that
I agree with you that it's kind of what I said earlier with the food systems comment, that I think it naturally falls into the structure of the letter, what council has the purview and ability to do, et cetera.
yeah. So I think that food systems is the one that most cleanly fits in with what we have. So
Better with.
What do we wanna do from here?
I think from here. Yes, let's finish the meeting. But I think the idea will be like set up a shared Google Doc.
Yeah.
And then start writing the introduction, these 3 paragraphs and a conclusion. And then just iterate on that document. And
but we do have to be very careful. Again, we cannot violate open meeting laws on Google Doc. That would be, it seems silly, but that would be bad. Let's
Jail.
not do
Does
that.
it make sense for one person to do like a pretty rough draft, so then people have something to work off of? Or,
I think so, because that's what we did last few years ago. I think it's easy to just go and edit.
Yeah.
Rather than unless I mean, like, I think, for example, the maybe we can take a bucket, because I think I would feel comfortable writing about food systems if you did all the research.
yeah,
I don't know who wants to take the resilience in the regulations.
I'm not saying you have to do it, I'm just saying, should somebody, like, I'm happy to write a draft or whatever.
If you want to tackle it, I will, yeah, I mean, like, that will
Just kind of write what
save us some
comes.
time, and then we can just iterate. So if you want to take charge on that, yeah, that will be.
Yeah, I'll
good.
just do like super rough,
That's fine.
just to get something on paper.
Yep,
And then we can all go in.
Please.
So you're gonna do the whole thing, all of it, or just the food system?
No, the whole thing,
Okay.
but just like super rough, so then people can have something to work off, change it,
that's
make
fine.
lots of edits.
Alice, are you okay with that as
I'm
well?
not attached.
Yeah, I think that also makes sense from like having a cohesive voice from the start and then and a similar language structure, and then I think it'll take form nicely from there.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
I'll just do it based off, I took notes.
I will also point out, if we want to keep having the meeting, we do need to specifically extend the
I
meeting.
think we can.
I'm gonna get it
2
done.
minutes.
2 more minutes. I got time. All right,
Nothing like a good deadline.
Do all of the things.
Jonathan, is it okay if we move 6A? I want to put a motion to move that to next meeting. Okay,
This was the update on our climate lawsuit
Yeah.
hearing last week?
Yeah.
Yeah, happy to.
Okay, guys, so let's move item 6A to the next meeting. I'm gonna put forward a motion to do that. Anybody second?
That.
Thank you. Is there anything on the calendar preview that is important or?
Yeah, thanks, Hernan. Just a couple of things that I wanted to flag for the board, especially, and you'll be getting a briefing at your next meeting, so we'll make sure to add this piece that we just moved to the next meeting. At next week's meeting, council will be getting an update from staff, but mostly from Excel Energy. We just had our community advisory panel meeting this past Monday night. The purpose of the update, and it will be under matters, so near the end of the meeting, I will send you the link so you have access to that. But it'll be under the matters, and the under matters from the city manager. Excel is going to be giving a presentation on their progress towards meeting their emissions milestone and the implications of that. And then staff will do a short portion afterwards to talk about some of the activities that are in motion is associated with the Excel partnership. So that's the one piece I wanted to make sure that was on your radar. And then a few upcoming things that will also be coming to the board, obviously. Update to the energy code, we'll be bringing that back next month before that goes back to council. And then we'll be bringing forward the next pieces of that and our work around embodied carbon in our buildings. We are scheduling some work, and we'll be coming back to the board on updates and recommendations on, landscape equipment. You talked about this last year, and so that'll be coming back to you. And then we have other couple things that will be calendaring with you, but those are more immediate, so in the next 2 months.
Okay, thank you. So, the next EAB meeting is scheduled for March 6th. And with that, we can adjourn the meeting. Wait a second.
Sure, I'll second that.
Thank you. All right, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Good discussion.
Thanks, I feel like
Bye, Alex.